Hello, and thank you again so much for joining us for this training session today. I'm Henry Shepard, Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, and I want to thank my colleagues Haley Lewis, Andy Schaefer, Phoebe Ammond, and the whole initiative team for preparing this and upcoming training and mentoring sessions. We're so pleased to be continuing this series of training sessions. If you joined any of last week's online events, whether our grant competition kickoff or our first training session, welcome back. And if you're joining us for the first time today, welcome to your first Stevens Initiative event. We're thrilled to tell you more about our program and more about our response to the pandemic. A brief overview of today's agenda. I'll continue this welcome and introduce our presenters. And my colleague Andy Schaefer will provide a brief overview of today's topics. We will have guest speakers talking about program design and activity planning for virtual exchange programs and discussing some fundamentals of good facilitation practices. Then we'll turn to a discussion and questions from the audience. And finally, we'll wrap up and review upcoming training and mentoring opportunities. The Stevens Initiative is an international partnership aimed at making international learning experiences accessible to an unprecedented number of young people through virtual exchange programs. We focus on our programming on the United States and the Middle East and North Africa. The program is a lasting tribute to Ambassador Chris Stevens, who dedicated his career to building bridges between people in the United States and the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA region. The initiative was conceived and developed in 2015 in close partnership with the family of Ambassador Stevens, and the initiative is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State with funding provided by the U.S. government and administered by the Aspen Institute. Additional funding is provided by the Bezos Family Foundation and the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates. I want to briefly just acknowledge the need here. We think every young person must have the knowledge and skills to prosper in an interconnected but very disrupted world. We know that even in the best of times, only a small minority of young people have access to in-person international experiences such as studying abroad. And during a period of intense travel restrictions, social distancing, and economic hardship, nearly all young people have had their in-person education and exchange plans disrupted. We believe technology can be used to conduct virtual exchange to help young people remain connected and continue their international learning at all times, and especially during this crisis. So what do we mean by virtual exchange? Well, briefly, and we've outlined it here, by virtual exchange, we mean programs that use technology to connect people for education and exchange. Virtual exchange programs typically serve young people. Many programs are international, connecting participants in different countries to help them gain what we call global competencies, among many other areas of knowledge, skill, and ability. The Stevens Initiative, again, is focused on building the field of virtual exchange, and we do that in three main ways. We make grants to help scale up and prove concepts in virtual exchange practice. We collect, share knowledge about promising practices and other resources for the field. And we try to facilitate and lead an effort to advocate for virtual exchange, to mobilize more resources and bring more people into the community. This response to the pandemic includes a few tracks. First, sessions like today's session, giving an orientation to virtual exchange. We have follow-up small group and individual mentoring and coaching sessions that you'll learn more about at the end of today's session and also in a follow-up email. We have curated a list of resources that we've posted on our website to help people learn more about virtual exchange, get involved in the field, and improve their practices, especially for those new to virtual exchange. And we've called for proposals for a fund for US, Middle East, North Africa virtual exchange programs. There are some details here on the slide about different kinds of things we're funding, and you can learn a lot more on the link on our website, stevensinitiative.org. I'm so pleased to introduce today's presenters. Jamila Jaffrey is a curriculum developer from the STEAM Museum program. Khaloud Khalifa is a facilitation fellow and senior facilitator for SOLIA, in addition to her role as a lecturer of journalism and politics at the University of Applied Sciences in Vienna, Austria. We have joining us as discussants for today's session, presenters from last week's session, Ed Graggart, formerly of IERN, and John Rubin, formerly of the SUNY Coil Center. And my colleague Andy Schaefer and I are providing comments as well. I'm so pleased to turn it over to Andy to kick off a bit of a substantive introduction to what we'll be covering in the rest of today's webinar. Andy, if you can hear me, please go ahead.
Thank you, Henry, and hello, everyone. I think a lot of you are new here and new to us, and I'm guessing that a lot of you are here because in-person exchange programs that you oversee have been canceled or disrupted due to the pandemic. So if you are new here, we are not here to tell you that virtual exchange is a perfect substitute for an in-person exchange program. Nothing is truly going to replace the experience of an in-person exchange or a study abroad program. But virtual exchange can still be very impactful as an education tool to promote intercultural learning or global education, 21st century skills, global competence, and social emotional learning. And importantly, we are also here today because virtual exchange can connect us and connect young people internationally while we are currently isolated. In order for a virtual exchange program to be impactful, you are going to need, in addition to some other things that we'll discuss during Thursday's training, to make sure you have a strong plan for activities that promote cross-cultural collaboration, and that you are facilitating meaningful activities. All of this is hugely flexible to achieve the outcomes that I just mentioned. So please keep in mind that you can be flexible when designing your activities, and you should be flexible when implementing as you learn about what works well for your program and for your participants. Since virtual exchange may not necessarily be organic, you're not just immersed in a new university or school or country, you're logging onto a computer. So you should think about topics and activities that will be conducive to meaningful cross-cultural engagement. What's it going to take participants beyond a hello and what's your favorite food? There's nothing wrong with that, but think about how we can take this deeper. Think about topics and activities that will meet your learning objectives and that will meet the needs of your participants and your partners. And lastly, think about activities and topics that will be engaging for young people on all sides of the exchange. And I really want to stress the last two bullets that you're seeing here. Needs and interests on either side or all sides of an exchange may be different, which is fine, but just be sure to take into account those needs on all sides of your exchange. Some of you were with us for the first training. You might have seen this slide during that training. Virtual exchange can be integrated into any subject matter or take place around any kind of a theme. And it can be an important learning tool around any of these themes. You'll see here that it can be incorporated into a variety of topics, and it's important to note that a virtual exchange doesn't necessarily need to be about the exchange itself. It can be about any kind of a curricular topic. When considering activity planning, think about what you need to do ahead of time to prepare for the virtual exchange and also to level set. Have participants and facilitators know what they're there for and have them know what they're going to be doing. Consider reviewing norms and expectations for appropriate cross-cultural dialogue. This might be a first time for many. Consider the progression of activities. It can be helpful to start with icebreakers and getting participants to know each other right off the bat. And also consider what happens in the figurative room or the collaboration space. Are there full classes interacting with each other? Are there small groups working as a team? Or are participants engaging one-on-one with a partner? Or is there some kind of combination of any of what I just mentioned? Activities can be dialogue-based. They can also be project-based, or programs may include activities from both of these very, very broad buckets. Consider what activities around these big buckets will help ensure a meaningful cross-cultural collaboration on a project or a meaningful cross-cultural dialogue. Depending on the program, not all activities may be squarely about the exchange or the cross-cultural collaboration. Some projects may include readings that participants are doing on their own that's kind of serving the broader purpose of the exchange. And the last thing I'll say about content and activity planning before I touch briefly on facilitation is to refine. Figure out what works and what doesn't work each time you implement. Get feedback from your participants and from your stakeholders and your partners and improve. This doesn't have to be static. It can grow with your needs, your partner's needs, and your participants' needs. So to touch briefly on facilitation, consider when designing a virtual exchange program how you will facilitate the actual program activities in addition to cross-cultural learning and dialogue. Because there may not be quite the immersion as there would be during an in-person exchange or study abroad, there's going to be some work required to ensure that these things happen. So consider how you might facilitate synchronous, which is real-time communication and activities, as well as asynchronous or not in real-time activities. This might look different for each type of this communication. And there also might, depending on the program, be instances in which some collaboration is occurring in the absence of a facilitator. Teams might work on a project on their own time, for example, but this doesn't mean that a program isn't facilitated. The idea is that there are still prepared facilitators or adults ensuring that the activities are happening and that participants feel supported and safe. And on that note, facilitators should be mindful of different folks in the space, which Khaloud will talk a lot more about later on. Facilitators may be adults, they might be educators or other prepared adults, or they might be near peers who are prepared to facilitate amongst peers. In order to prepare facilitators for virtual exchange, this might include a very specific training, or it might not entail a very specific training. It may or may not be necessary depending on your program, but folks should be prepared to implement the activities if that's germane to your program, and also to encourage constructive and potentially uncomfortable, but notably safe dialogue and collaboration. And again, you should consider different communication styles and power dynamics when considering your facilitation plan. So that is a very broad overview, and now I am excited to turn it over to Jamila to go way more into depth on content and activity planning. So take it away, Jamila.
Thank you, Andy and Henry, and a big thank you to the Stevens Initiative for hosting training sessions during this time. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today with you to share some thoughts about program design in virtual exchange environments. And I'd like to start by asking you to think of a time when you learned to do something that you really enjoy doing. So maybe it's playing an instrument or knitting, cooking, or some other hobby. Who are you with? And as you think about that briefly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me. Next slide. So as you think about that, I want to tell you about me. And so I began my career as a middle and high school science teacher before moving into the nonprofit sector, where I started designing and teaching programs for youth from communities underrepresented in the sciences. And as part of that work, I became an outdoor educator, bringing young people with me to parks to engage in outdoor learning. And I also developed the curriculum for STEAM Museum, which features digital exhibits co-created by students working collaboratively online. And I share this because, like many of you, I consider myself a practitioner, someone who is learning a lot by working directly with young people and teachers, and as someone who has moved between classroom and virtual exchange learning spaces. So my goals today are to share some reflections designing virtual exchange programs. Next slide, please. So STEAM Museum is a virtual exchange program funded by the Stevens Initiative that began 4 years ago, bringing together students from classrooms in Chicago Public Schools with students in Casablanca, with the goal of students collaborating to create digital exhibits about themes in science, technology, engineering, and art, which is what the S, T, E, and A stand for. These themes were chosen because they are disciplines and practices that are cross-cultural and shape our everyday lives. And typically, museums showcase physical artifacts, and they can be exclusionary spaces, privileging some forms of art or expression over others. In STEAM Museum, the digital artifacts and exhibits are created and curated by young people, and they showcase how young people are communicating and thinking about these ideas. Next slide, please. So borrowing from the definition that was shared earlier, we know that virtual exchange uses technology to connect people for education. And as a program or curriculum designer, I like to dive into the word education more deeply and ask some questions. What is learning in the first place? What do we know about how people learn? And since this is about people, what are my underlying assumptions about them? Next slide, please. When we think about learning, the first thing that often pops up is that it's a cognitive process, engaging the mind and reasoning, deepening our understanding about ideas. And that's true, but both the research in learning and our own experiences tell us that learning is so much more than this. It's social, cultural, and it's other things too, political, moral, and so on. And going back to that first question I asked you, our own experiences tell us that the things we learned, whether it's something that we do or something that we value, were mediated or facilitated by other people and our relationship with them, such as mentors, peers, family, and even community. So if we widen our perspective about learning, the learning environment that we construct in a virtual exchange program needs to take into account how people learn as a social experience. Next slide, please. And because virtual exchange is for people, as a program or curriculum designer, I find it useful to identify some of my underlying assumptions about people in this process, because these assumptions will influence how I work with others, how I create activities, and I encourage you to articulate some of your own assumptions as well. So number one, I begin with the assumption that the practices and content are already present in some form within the communities that I'm working with. So this underlying assumption was a real driver in how we designed an experience that acknowledged that science, art, technology, and engineering practices already exist among young people in Chicago and Casablanca. And secondly, I assume that activities will be meaningful if they build on and extend people's everyday practices, values, and ways of knowing. This value positioned STEAM Museum as an asset-based approach, and it influenced how we wrote our activities. And third, as we all know, our network world has broadened who has access to technology. In many ways, digital technologies can perpetuate and reestablish dominant ideas, but it also has the opportunity to diversify and broaden perspectives and voices. When working with young people, particularly from marginalized communities, it's important to consider how the technologies being used in a virtual exchange program will assert and amplify such identities. We also know that people use social media to curate and share what's important and valuable to them. Next slide, please. I'd like to share 5 high-level program design elements that inform our virtual exchange program in STEAM Museum. These 5 have shifted and broadened over time, much of it in response to what students in the program were saying, as well as the teachers who we engage at multiple points in the program. So let's start with the first one, setting goals. Next slide, please. Thank you. Setting goals. So whenever there's a virtual exchange program happening, participants are not only engaging with the content matter, they're also engaging in a set of skills that we can call non-cognitive or social. So these include global competency skills such as collaboration, critical thinking, and communication. Sometimes they're called 21st century skills because they are a set of mindsets and practices that are needed in a globalized economy. And sometimes they're framed as social emotional skills. In any case, it's important to intentionally identify the skills that your program is asking students to practice, and then to dig deeper and ask, what do these skills look like across cultures? How do we make explicit what the skills look like in action? And how do young people get feedback on how they're developing these skills? This is particularly important because we know from research on learning, particularly in the workforce sector, that a key driver for improving non-cognitive skills is meaningful and constructive feedback. So here's an example of what collaboration skills look like. These are from MHA Labs, a Chicago-based organization that identifies building blocks of core social, emotional, and cognitive skills for young people. And as a curriculum writer, I use them as a resource when I'm writing activities to help myself be more clear about the exact tasks that students will be doing. You might not incorporate all of these skills, and that's all right. When designing your program or your activities, instead of just saying that participants are building collaboration skills, think about how they activate those skills and what it looks like. Once you do that, think about what the tasks might look like to accomplish those skills and how the facilitators or educators will be equipped to give feedback to participants so that they can improve on the skills that you have identified as necessary to the program. So in STEAM Museum, for example, we started including response videos where participants could respond explicitly to each other's ideas about the digital artifacts being produced for the online exhibits. And that was partly because we wanted to strengthen how young people were encouraging the ideas, opinions, and contribution of their peers. And that's a skill that drives successful collaboration. But the other reason it's important to identify these skills is because while no one culture owns the idea of collaboration, the ways in which it is activated or manifested look differently. So by not being explicit, we run the risk of privileging one cultural expression over another. The next slide shows one on verbal communication, which I think is particularly important for virtual exchange programs because sometimes programs are designed with the outcome that there will be, social harmony between groups of people from different cultures at the end. There may be tensions in some of the topics discussed in your virtual exchange program. Effective communication is not that those tensions will necessarily be resolved or that one participant ends up agreeing with another. Effective communication is really about listening actively, reframing and gauging our understanding of the other person's perspective by asking questions. So on the next slide, you'll see the second element, which is about connecting on everyday practices. This has been something we've really expanded in STEAM Museum over the years for two reasons. One, teachers in the program need flexibility based on the language ability of their students and the vocabulary needed. If a teacher is working on a restaurant unit, for example, he or she might direct their students to focus on those videos first. And secondly, we wanted to avoid a representation of a homogeneous culture that is American or Moroccan. As we know, there are many subcultures in any country, but in particular, most of our students in Chicago are Black and Latino. And these are cultures that can be erased by presenting a dominant cultural view of America. So focusing on individual stories and perspectives was much more meaningful to our program. Connecting to the everyday also provides adaptability and responsiveness. So for example, with the COVID crisis, we were able to quickly create prompts that relate to how young people are responding to closures. In STEAM Museum, students use videos to get to know one another. These videos are accessed by logging in and then following prompts. We provided 12 prompts, but teachers and students can choose which ones they want to do and post. Each video is short, no more than 30 seconds. The other reason videos are important is that it allows the speaker to choose his or her language of expression. While most of the dialogue does indeed happen in English, we did not want to make the assumption that the language of discourse had to be English because it underpins French or Arabic as secondary. And secondly, video carries body language and facial expression, which are important contextual indicators in cross-cultural communication. All of the prompts were informed and reviewed by the teachers and facilitators in our program for cultural appropriateness. So for example, we removed the prompt asking young people about their houses or rooms because some of our students may have experienced homelessness or their homes may not be safe spaces. Next slide, please. When students reach the point where they're creating artifacts for their digital exhibits, we provide choices on the medium. So video, audio, text, or image. The range allows for students to post their poems, artwork, digital videos, photography, or even an interview they've conducted. Again, providing choices and connecting the work to everyday practices has been important to us in program design. Next slide, please. The third element is about creating a shared purpose. Individual videos back and forth are critical to one-on-one relationship building. A shared purpose provides a collective framing for the recognition. In other words, participants aren't just engaging to pursue a personal interest, but to make a meaningful contribution to their community or create work that is shared with others. It is more akin to everyday learning outside of school, which generally happens as part of engaging in an activity or goal that isn't explicitly educational, such as getting food on a table or playing games. Something that is important to consider also is how the work will be shared publicly for recognition. In STEAM museums, student artifact collection is pushed to an online website for the public, and we are explicit from the onset that students are working on a digital museum. A shared purpose also has to be meaningful. We don't want participants creating something just for the sake of the project. How does it fit in an existing gap so that student voices are necessary? So for example, our project director, Lisa Roberts, provides video and text at the beginning of the program that identify museums as public spaces that have traditionally excluded the voices and perspectives of the people for whom they exist, including those represented by the students who are creating the STEAM museum. Next slide, please. The fourth element is providing both asynchronous and synchronous opportunities for participants to communicate with one another. The asynchronous method allows students to post videos in their own time. And as I mentioned, these are often very short. The asynchronous method also allows students to build confidence, practice, and to reflect. It's also much more adaptable and flexible given scheduling and time constraints. This is something that could, for example, be done outside of a classroom. In STEAM museums, students can post in English, Arabic, or French, which is important because we found in the synchronous exchanges, English becomes a default language. With videos being done in Arabic and French, we can, one, ask the English speaker to become an active listener, and two, try to shift the idea that all Americans speak English as their native or only tongue. For STEAM Museum, language practice is an important element, but even more important is effective communication. So students may use a mix of multiple languages. They might show a picture on the video, pulling up something on their phone, for example. They could do charades. They could hold up a sign with a word written on it to clarify, and so on. The point is, it doesn't matter so much the method or the accuracy of the communication, so much as their ability and confidence to draw on multiple tools that enable communication and connection. To help students with this, teachers and facilitators guide students on how to create and respond to asynchronous videos. And you'll hear more about facilitation techniques when my colleague Khulud speaks shortly. Next slide. Our synchronous opportunities are scheduled video conferences between the two classrooms. Facilitators work with students to co-develop a shared agenda for these. And to prepare for these opportunities, teachers and facilitators do role play, and they also model a conversation. Because we're working with larger groups of students in the classroom, sometimes 25 to 30 on one side, our video conference agendas have a lot of time for instantaneous dialogue, and we found that to be really helpful. The students love to sing, for example. All right, and the last one is finally professional support. There is a lot of preparatory support with teachers and our partners. With our teachers, for example, we ask them to exchange videos and emails back and forth and provide prompts for them to do so before the program begins. We also make sure that roles and expectations are clear. And to support equity in the partnerships, we identify the best communication modes before the program begins. Some teachers, for example, prefer WhatsApp, some email, and we also want to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to share data, findings, and all the curriculum materials, and so on. Preparatory work is also an important time to identify the needs and motivations of your teachers and partners so that you can adapt the curriculum or activities accordingly. And throughout the program, teachers are supported by facilitators, one in Casablanca and one in Chicago. And we have weekly debriefs with the facilitators so that we can reflect on what is happening in real time and adapt accordingly. Next slide. Thank you. Thanks. I hope my reflections have been helpful, and I thank you and the Stevens Initiative for the opportunity to share them.
Jamila, thank you so much for leading us through that presentation. I'm so excited to see the questions that our audience will have for you. If you're listening to the session, I encourage you to open the Q&A button on your Zoom application and type any questions you have for us there. You can also use the chat feature at any time to let us know if you're having any technical issues or any other questions or comments you might have, but let's try to focus the substantive discussion on questions that you submit through the Q&A button. If I could try to kick off the conversation to reflect on what Jamila has just shared, I'd love to ask Khulud to talk a little bit about the point of connection between, or handoff from, or interplay between activity planning and an activity plan, or the activities that have been designed and shared, with the art of facilitation. So Khulud, you are a longtime facilitator and facilitation coach, in addition to your other roles. And I'm really curious to know, what is the kind of resource or framework or agenda or curriculum that you have found to be really useful in your hands as you are preparing for and getting into a synchronous session, which I know is what you're very familiar with? What's a good way for a curriculum or an activity plan to set you up for success?
Thank you, Henry. Hello, everyone. So based off of what Jamila said, she touched on some very important points. When you're preparing a curriculum or an activity or an agenda for facilitation, it's really important to include multiple things. So icebreakers are very, very important because it allows groups and people that are not, that, you know, maybe they've met for the first time or even the fifth time, but you continue to learn about others. So icebreakers are very important. You can be very creative with icebreakers. Also, activities reflect the group stages, which I'll be talking about in my slides. But it really depends on the kind of communication dialogue that you want to encourage in your group. So if it's cross-cultural dialogue, then you might want to touch on identity. If it's collaboration, then you're looking to help students you know, try to make decisions or negotiate or use communication to come up with a unified goal. So it really depends on the kind of program that you're leading, but it's never really it's never linear. There's so many different aspects that are important to include depending on the week that you're in and depending on the group stage and the group process that you've reached.
Thanks, Khulud. I'm reviewing the questions that have started to come in via the Q&A box, and I wanted to pose one to Ed, who's joining us as a discussant today, and also to Jamila or Khulud if they have anything to add. The question is, how are students held accountable for completing their asynchronous activities? And I would maybe expand that a little bit to say, just generally, how do you approach accountability in a program where you're setting a plan and then hoping that it's used by people in a manner that is at least consistent with the vision that you had? So that would be true for students and others involved in the program. So Ed and Jamila especially, do you want to share a little bit about how you think about, you know, the handoff from the plan to, you know, what you hope happens, and how you support or encourage that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Ed. I really liked the way Jamila put it in terms of making sure that the plan and the outcomes were well known by all the participants in advance. Obviously, that's very key. But I also think, and I don't know, maybe it's just our experience, but flexibility is another word she used quite a bit in there. And that we've learned over the years that the plans sometimes can go in directions that you didn't expect. Because young people get really motivated or encouraged to think about new directions or new concepts that they hadn't before. Many people actually, many of them say they learned a lot about their own culture, about themselves as part of the cross-cultural dialogues that were happening. And so that kind of evaluation along the way, saying, where are we in that non-linear, very definitely non-linear trek toward what we wanted to fulfill in this virtual exchange is really key. And it may well be that there's some little shifting and program adjustments. With asynchronous, of course, you have the dialogue written, you have a track, you have a history. And in many platforms, including the iEarn one, you can click on any student and get the entire outcome of what that student, how that student has participated, with whom they've had dialogues, What did they say? What languages did they use in the dialogue? And so being able to see how any individual student is on that trek, on that journey, is really key. But also just that flexibility. I love how she put it as it's a social experience that they're going through. They're sharing their own lives, and they come across and you learn that they are real people. And I think that's a real key aspect.
Thanks so much, Ed. Jamila, if I can turn back to you and just sort of ask the question in a further way. We often think of things that happen in an education setting as being related to evaluating and tracking progress for young people. And I know that there are certainly aspects of a virtual exchange where that kind of assessment or evaluation, and I'm using those in non-technical terms, can be relevant and fruitful perhaps for all involved. But I'm really curious to know your philosophy about what you are hoping happens and how you are supporting people, how you're supporting young people to have a successful experience. How much does it look like, evaluating and giving feedback on how people are doing? How much does it look like other kinds of interactions?
Well, with STEAM Museum, the students are working in classrooms. So, for example, in Chicago, working with the teachers is really important in sort of identifying what their needs and motivations are in terms of their unit plan for the year. So we'll find, for example, that some of the teachers want to use the videos as a way to practice starter sentences or as a way to practice, certain types of vocabulary. And so we provide in our curriculum, again, having flexibility is really important. And so as part of our curriculum, we provide rubrics, again, not about, sort of the grades or anything, but sort of rubrics that are assessing how students are, completing their work and being responsive and sort of the cross-cultural exchange part of it. And it's really up to the teachers how they want to use those rubrics. And we're very sort of formative, right? As we constantly touch base with the teachers as they're doing the program, and we meet with our facilitators weekly. And so we're able to get a sense of kind of where the students are and to respond and adapt accordingly. And the other thing is that the student work is posted on sort of it's a closed social network, so to speak. It was called Chicago City of Learning, and so students log in, and so the teachers and the people that are sort of the administrators in STEAM Museum, we have access to those videos, and so we go in and part of my work is going in weekly and sort of seeing how the students are responding to one another, and then sometimes what we'll do is we'll sort of pull out some of these videos that. And share them and say, this is a great video to share with our students or to share with the larger sort of STEAM Museum community because it exemplifies, X, Y, Z about a type of communication.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question that gets at the role for, or asks if there's a role for cross-cultural communication training either before a program starts or maybe in the very early stages of a program. And as Andy, my colleague, previewed early on, we don't feel that it's necessary for cross-cultural communication to be the focus or substantive topic of a virtual exchange, because the virtual exchange is going to involve cross-cultural communication. But with that being said, and maybe especially for younger age groups, is there some value in working with those young people before or during the early stages of a program to help them make the most of this kind of international opportunity? I'm happy to start with Jamila, but then also to turn to Ed and Hulud as well.
I mean, some of the preparatory work that we do with the students is really about sort of getting to know a little bit about each other's sort of where everyone lives. So we have part of our curriculum is sort of preparing students sort of about what a museum is, why the work is really important and meaningful, and then also a little bit about each other's countries. But we really leverage the whole beginning part of the curriculum, which is called Getting to Know You. That's a place where we really leverage the cross-cultural exchange, and we really invest there, and this is something definitely we've learned over the years. So it's sort of at the beginning of when we first started the program, we really wanted to jump into content pretty quickly, and we learned that it's really important to provide time for students to just sort of literally get to know one another, and so that that is the place really where most of that cultural exchange is happening. And again, that's facilitated by people who are in the classroom with the students and with the teacher.
Ed or Halud, do you have a brief word to add on this question of what to do early on or before the program starts to prepare people for this kind of space?
I'll just say a few words. I really agree what Jamila just said, that having that initial trust building, community building experience is really important. But also, you know, in our experience in virtual exchanges is that young people, based on their own experience in social media and other kinds of technology, really kind of just say things that normally people wouldn't actually necessarily say face to face. I mean, they're just very open. And I think it's really important to spend time on both sides or multiple sides of a virtual exchange in that kind of preparatory stage of how words matter, how language matters, how images of one's culture aren't necessarily understood when they're spoken about or said in a certain way. So I think having that kind of that etiquette, that cultural sensitivity, that respect, all those kinds of things at the very beginning, I think really are important, and in fact will help shape the content that happens in the dialogue as well.
Halud, I think it's if it's okay, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation on some fundamentals for strong facilitation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Henry. So I know that I have limited time, so I'm going to do my best to give a comprehensive overview and cover as much ground as I can. It's important that I clarify the facilitation I'll be referring to is synchronous, so it always happens in real time and ideally involves a group of 8 to 12 participants. So what you see in front of you is a brief outline of what I'll be discussing and its relevance to the concept and practice of facilitation. So firstly, I'll talk about the difference between facilitation and teaching and what needs to happen to shift the focus from one to the other. I'll talk about different models of facilitation, and then I'll talk about core elements that pertain to facilitation and are encouraged to ensure a successful exchange. I'll also talk about the different skills and tools that you can learn to help navigate through facilitation. And then I'll touch on group dynamics and what to look out for should issues surface. It's my understanding that the majority of you here are representing higher education. So I just want to be clear that whether it is high school or university, this is an all-encompassing approach to facilitation, which isn't age specific, but rather model specific. And what I mean is, depending on the model, you may change or tweak curriculums, but even then there are overlaps in techniques and activities that you use. And with that said, facilitators belong to a range of different experience levels, and really anyone here who has a desire can go through training and learn the skills to be an effective facilitator. So facilitation is very different from teaching in that teaching is one directional. It's a dissemination of knowledge from the teacher to the students, where they tend to really rely on teachers for their expertise on a specific subject matter. Facilitation, on the other hand, focuses on us facilitators being learning process leaders. It is participant-centered, so the focus is solely on the group, and what we do is assist and support participants to learn together as a collective through dialogue, through cross-cultural communication and collaboration. One of the biggest differences is that unlike teaching, it is a 2 or multiple form of interaction where everyone is encouraged to express their own ideas and opinions. And by focusing on the participants, you automatically allow for self-awareness and self-reflection to take place. And this helps students understand the why behind the what they believe in, and they recognize their own biases. This encourages and hones critical thinking skills. So how to look at a topic or event from multiple angles and evaluating it to better understand it. It also inspires curiosity and ownership. So students are likely to want to learn more, and they ask questions with the intent to understand the other. Ownership here means groups depend less and less on the facilitator, and instead they step up and lead their own discussions and direct the conversations themselves. It also cultivates empathy and vulnerability, so that really building a safe space for participants to open up is the goal, and for them to share their personal experiences that can allow for deeper connection by listening and holding that space for the other to be listened to without judgment. Next slide, please. There are various facilitation models, but I'll be touching on a couple today, the dialogue model and the collaboration model. What's important to note here is that they overlap and rarely are standalone models. The dialogue model focuses on discussion and not debate. It is about acknowledging and understanding the differences that are present in the virtual space and using dialogue to explore and engage these differences. The dialogue model can be applied to any group. So it can be from the same culture and can happen between participants, let's say, from different American universities who share the same nationality, are homogenous in that sense, but may have different political views. And dialogue would then engage that difference. Cross-cultural communication, though it still falls under the umbrella of dialogue, it really focuses on participants from different cultures across regions. These intercultural groups will consist of participants from at least 2 or more nationalities, and identity will be the key component or factor in dialogue. So activities that draw on identity pave a way for enriching discussions around complex identities, identity threat, stereotypes, and cultural misunderstandings. The way to approach and explore these topics is still very heavily focused on dialogue, but the framing may differ. Now, the collaboration model can be homogeneous or intercultural, but the focus here is to collaborate on a project together and meet weekly goals or targets. It is far more structured, and the project's outcome is key to a successful program. And the goals focus on skill building, which is tied to attitude development. And these attitudes include respect, open-mindedness, curiosity, and a self-awareness, which in turn allows for clearer communication and the ability to make decisions as a group and to negotiate as well. So how do you facilitate, how do you as a facilitator engage students and make certain that they've reached the desired outcome, be it the group's own expectations or the program that you're designing's outcomes? So firstly, it is imperative that you explain your role as a facilitator and that you do not have any decision-making authority. You are there solely to ensure for an effective dialogue to take place. And with that, it is also your responsibility to identify key points that could lead to a fruitful discussion. Building on effective group dynamic is also a core responsibility, and you do so by creating a safe space for participants. And then what we do in most of our session is we dedicate the last 10 minutes for closing rounds at the end of every session, which helps participants look at each individual session and reflect on what they've learned and their immediate impact and what they've taken away from that session. Next slide, please. So facilitating in virtual exchange really focuses on, among other things, implementing activities, or what we call tools in CELIA. And that allows for direct and effective communication among participants. So for you as a facilitator, you have to consider 2 very important things. So one, what is the purpose of doing this activity, and how does learning happen in these activities? One method of choosing an activity is by evaluating and following, evaluating the following why. Why is this activity useful for the group? The how does that tool fit into the group's learning process? How does it add to their experience? And then the what learning do you hope to achieve with this activity? Maintaining neutrality and multi-partiality are very important key components of facilitation, because it is your role to ensure for dialogue to be as diverse and honest as possible. So what I mean by neutrality here is that you as a facilitator can never ever contribute to any discussion throughout the program. And the importance of this is by not expressing your own views, you don't side with an opinion or you don't agree with anything that is being said, because then you run the risk of creating a sense of alienation or a lack of comfort or distrust, right? So people then won't open up in the group. Multi-partiality is important because it's being curious about and paying attention to different opinions that are being expressed in the group, and including the ones that may not be represented in the room. And by including them, you help enrich the conversation that's already taking place. Having said that, there are challenges or traps almost every single facilitator faces. And the ones that I've included in the slide are correcting facts, being asked direct questions, or building rapport with participants. So the good news is there are ways to address these without being part of the conversation and breaching neutrality. An example of building rapport with participants is not by sharing any personal information, but by being genuinely curious. So you're actively listening, you're following up with questions. Sometimes you might even be using humor. And if a group asks you, hey, what do you think? Then you can turn around and say, you know, guys, this is really about you. It's not about me. And then you can follow up and say, well, what are other perspectives out there? And that way you don't compromise your neutrality. So whether you are a solo facilitator or a co-facilitation pair, it is important to prepare adequately for a session. Take into consideration how much time you have. Our sessions at CELIA typically run for 2 hours, but with that in mind, determine how much time each activity requires, and keep in mind the outcomes that you want the outcomes that you want for the activities that you're utilizing, and then allocate the time accordingly. It's very crucial that facilitators ensure a space for reflection and debrief. So facilitators make the dialogue process explicit through observation and meta discussions. And what we mean by meta discussions is having discussions about discussions, right? So you can then kind of stop groups in the middle of maybe week 4, and you can ask them, so what do you think of the discussions you've had so far? And by doing so, you're able to do like a quick pulse check and see if they feel like they're moving in a direction that is impactful for them. And it also gives them an idea of where others are in the group and have a better understanding of what needs to happen to enrich their experience, learning experience collectively. And mind you, meta discussions can happen whether the group is doing really great or maybe not so great. Next slide, please. So this slide shines light on a number of things to consider as a facilitator. And these things might impact both you and the group you're working with. So firstly, we must engage in some of our own self-reflection and ask ourselves, you know, what are our own triggers? We're people with thoughts and ideas, and we have our own biases, and it is important to be aware of them so that they don't interfere with the group, but also so that you can navigate through the discussion in a healthy manner. We cultivate curiosity and leading by example, right? So as a facilitator, you yourself make sure to ask questions that allow for vulnerability or personal experience to be expressed. When a participant has the courage to share something very real about themselves, it's pretty amazing to see the domino effect and how others are ready then to do the same. Summarizing and paraphrasing are also key in capturing the main points and helping move the conversation forward by posing new questions. And then finally, as questions are one of the most important tools in facilitation, it's very important to understand the range of questions and how they may gauge participants and impact the conversation, but also what they can do if they're used effectively and correctly. Next slide, please. So group dynamics and power dynamics are very big and rich topics to delve into, but I'll touch on a few common ones here. The first is tackling silence or disengaged groups. Sometimes it can be very difficult because either they are very shy participants, or they're uninterested, or they really just don't feel like taking part. And then what happens is getting them to talk can become a very, very difficult challenge. And I know many facilitators I've coached who expressed a deep sense of frustration, especially if this happens, you know, week after week. So it's about finding creative ways to tackle this. And more often than not, and I've mentioned this before, icebreakers are essential in warming up the group. It can be also breakout rooms, or if you're really struggling, maybe you can even pose a challenge for the group. Eventually, you get there, but it does require a lot of patience and persistence from your side as a facilitator. The second point is relying on different mediums of communication. So the room that I use to facilitate has a chat box. And some students, again, who are shy but want to participate will communicate via text instead of using the mic. And this could impact and discourage those who initially started using the mic to use it less and less. So it is our job here to encourage them to take the mic and to speak, and let them know that you will transcribe what they're saying. And it could be that some are of the participants who are shy or quieter are insecure about their English, and it might find it difficult to follow what other participants are saying. So by being there to transcribe not only what they're saying, but what other participants are saying, by paraphrasing or summarizing or asking clarifying questions, we help support them in their communication. Other typical aspects of group and power dynamics is managing strong emotions of disagreement, but more importantly, is managing very polite and politically correct groups who are solely focused on finding similarities, but don't really want to touch on differences. So it is important to address that and remind them that, you know, differences isn't bad. It's not a bad thing. On the contrary, to embrace it, and it can help us learn and practice curiosity. I've experienced conflict in groups only a handful of times throughout my facilitation over the years, but it can happen. And if it does happen, you do look for ways to turn it into a constructive learning environment by asking questions, by engaging in activities such as role play or critical thinking activities. And then last but not least, working with imbalanced groups can range from imbalance in talkative versus non-talkative participants, or a group with predominant nationality, and how do you ensure the conversation is balanced? And this can really apply to many different combinations, different affiliations, different religions and races. When we see this happen, and depending on the situation, we can acknowledge it by having a meta discussion about it, but also by finding ways through asking questions or implementing activities to ensure that it doesn't impact the group stages or the learning process. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Khulud. I really look forward to turning to you with audience questions in a few moments. We've had several questions come in, and we're going to start the question and answer section of this meeting in earnest in a few minutes. But I would like to start off with a question, if I could, to John Rubin. John, I think you're on the line. And I would be really curious to know, you were an innovator of the collaborative online international learning method of virtual exchange, or something that existed prior to the coining of the term virtual exchange and is now seen as overlapping with virtual exchange. And so I'm really curious to know if your COIL work, especially in the early days or as it's practiced by programs that you're familiar with now, how much does that pick up on or have any kind of affinity for the kind of commitment to dialogue facilitation that Khulud is talking about from a very unique kind of higher education virtual exchange? Is there something about the way that a COIL course is facilitated or taught that overlaps with what Khulud is talking about?
Yes, Henry. You can hear me, I assume.
Yep.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I found it incredibly interesting listening to Khulud and thinking about such questions. By an organization, so pretty much everybody that participates in a SOLIA exchange or facilitation is following a very clear model. In the COIL world, different universities and colleges begin to do this practice, but in many cases, one does it differently from the next. There isn't a central organization that is truly managing it to ensure that everybody has the same focus and goals. So this allows for a great breadth of practices under the name of COIL, but some of the underlying issues that she brought forward are, I would say, critical in any virtual exchange, and particularly a COIL course. So for instance, at the beginning, she made a differentiation between teaching practices and facilitation practices. And I would offer that this is one of the key crossings that a teacher in a COIL class must make. They cannot be deliverers of knowledge and expertise. They really need to be working on social contexts and social knowledge and interaction. So they have to become facilitators. So the same issue lurks there, but it's in a, let's say, looser structure, because COIL classes take place usually in two conjoined classrooms that have subject matter foci. So they have to take an environmental science class and a literature class and bring to them the idea that these students are not simply meeting to study a subject, but to engage each other and discuss their cultural perspective. So those are very much aligned. And finally, one other piece that I think is interesting to consider is the SOLIA model is synchronous. It's fully synchronous and solely synchronous, and it's a very powerful model. But I would say these same concerns, handled somewhat differently, are necessary in asynchronous engagements. You actually still need to facilitate them, and you still need to have the same concern of, for instance, not taking sides and of not making everybody somehow want to be alike. You want to develop people's views of themselves and the people they're working with and see their differences. But there are ways to handle it, I would say, asynchronously. There may be a little more at arm's length. It's not quite as dynamic as a face-to-face engagement, but those issues are there too and need to be embedded in those, let's just say, institutions that are developing COIL Virtual Exchange. They need to think about these same things.
Thanks so much, John. I'm really glad to open this space for discussion about these different models. Jamila, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit from your experience with a K-12 virtual exchange program or a secondary school virtual exchange program. What does it look like to facilitate asynchronously, or what does it look like to facilitate asynchronous international communication? And can you give an example of, if you're aware of some, of what a real triumph or sort of breakthrough looks like in that context?
So for in STEAM Museum, the ways that we facilitate asynchronous is that we have the prompts that are available when students log in, and they're arranged. The students are arranged into small teams. So there's a group of students, 2 or 3 students on the Chicago side that are paired with a small group of students, 2 or 3 students on the Casablanca side. So one important thing with asynchronous for us that has worked is, first getting them into small groups. The second thing that has helped for us is that when students are posting their videos or their images or their audio asynchronously, one thing that something that became apparent to us was that, again, we needed to create a safe space. And so when students log in, we actually created sort of a separate space for them. So sort of like, kind of a secondary layer so that they're just in their, what we call exhibit team. And so the exhibit team partners are sharing videos and text with one another, but they're in a space that isn't seen by other students. It's only seen by their teachers and their facilitators. So that's another thing that has helped. The other thing is that, I had mentioned before that when students create videos, sometimes you'll find like a really, just a student that has worked hard on and produced a great, like, sort of 30-second video about, their favorite restaurant or something like that. And so we will pull that out and have the teachers actually show that in the classroom. And then we provided sort of guidelines for how the teacher and the facilitator can walk the students through kind of looking at that video and sort of reading body language. What is this person trying to say? How would we respond? And a big piece of that about how would we respond is asking open-ended questions. One thing that Khulud mentioned that I think is really great is vulnerability. And so we want to encourage vulnerability. It's not about students having the accurate language or being able to say something sort of in the right, with the right grammar. It's more about building sort of the set of skills that you need to communicate what you're trying to say, the meaning of what you're trying to say well. And so all of those have been really great tools for us.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the screen share in a moment, and I'm going to ask the co-presenters and discussants to go on video if they're able to do so. And I'll take a moment to try to find the questions that we can ask of our audience. So give me just a moment, and while we're getting set up here, I would ask that you please use the Q&A box to type your questions, or you can feel free to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask a question out loud, and we will do our best to try to take your question. While I'm still getting situated here, we had several questions that came in early on in the presentation about how we navigate a couple things, a couple really common pitfalls or challenges, and that is how we engage with language differences, whether that's using a language like English, or how we try to use multiple languages or languages other than English to facilitate different kinds of communication. How is that something that you all have addressed in your work? And I'm welcome to start in one direction, and we'll go in another direction for the next question.
I'm happy to start. I can say with STEAM Museum, we've learned a lot about this from our teachers, and we're still learning a lot. And it is definitely something that we have to navigate. One thing that has helped us is because we're working with students that are just learning the languages, so they're not fluent, is to start with have starter sentences. And so we do a lot of role play. We have one activity where a student is speaking, and then again you keep asking, dig deeper, kind of, what else can you tell me, what else can you tell me, what else can you tell me, and sort of this kind of going in, using starter sentences and asking students to practice the skill of sort of open-ended questions. That's been really great. And again, the other thing is, because we're in language classes where we're fortunate to have teachers, the teacher is there in the classroom, and so he or she throughout the week is sort of building the students' sort of repertoire of vocabulary and asking those types of questions. And so whether that's being posted or writing things out for students, those things have been really helpful. But even with cultural exchanges, so again, in virtual exchange, there's going to be a time where it's uncomfortable, right? There's going to be, oops, I said something I wasn't supposed to say, or I might have offended someone. And that's actually those are really important moments actually in learning and teaching. Those are moments when we all learn, right? As people, we've all learned through that. And good facilitators and teachers, right? We help our students learn through those processes as well, and through those moments by identifying them and helping them move through them.
Let me add a different point. I think one of the main differentiations is whether the virtual exchange in question is explicitly about language learning. And I would say in some cases that can be very asymmetric. So for instance, a US class meeting with a class in Asia, in Turkey, I'll just pick a country, where the Turkish students, English is their second language, and for the Americans mostly, not all, it's their first language. In this case, those students in Turkey may see learning English and speaking to American native speakers, if they truly are, is a real reason for them to participate, where for the US students it may not be at all part of the reason they're doing this. So this asymmetry is an interesting fact to manage as a teacher. The other situation, though, that I want to talk to is, in many COIL collaborations, you have the dynamic I just described, where you have a class, let's say in English, but the other students are not fluent in English, maybe very unfluent in English, if that's a word. And so you have to find a strategy to deal with it. And in the more asynchronous situation, you have, for instance, groups, and possibly in each group of 4 students, I'll just suggest we're in Brazil here, because we've done a lot of work with this exact model in Brazil, where 1 student in each group will be a fluent English speaker. The other 3 will not. And so they will have their own little speaking community that will navigate these questions. They will work through the discussion, and then the native, or sorry, not native, fluent English speaker will actually be the main communicator. Obviously, this has drawbacks. It's not an ideal model. But I think if we limit all of our virtual exchange work to English language, we're leaving out half the world, if not more. And I think it's really problematic. Last comment, there's a group of universities gathering together in Latin America, forming something that seems to be being called the LATAM COIL Network. And the idea here is to bring together Spanish-speaking primarily and Portuguese-speaking universities to do COIL between their countries because of this particular issue.
Henry, in terms of iEarn, it actually works with K-12, first and second, third, and fourth graders. Language is obviously a very problematic sometimes, but a really key issue. And most times it's as John just mentioned, there is a real not symmetry relationship in terms of the language abilities. And we found that using graphics, using art, using things that the students who are in elementary grades have created themselves becomes then the spark for actually learning about the picture that I drew. And it may be a self-portrait, and it could be, why are you wearing that? And you learn the word for shirt. You learn various parts of language and culture based on the graphic images that a student has produced.
That's a big part of STEAM Museum as well. I mean, producing the artifacts is a really big piece, including, I mean, we have one which it's like a museum selfie, which I absolutely love that one, where students, they identify an artifact that they love. It could be in a museum or any place that's sort of a public space where there are artifacts, and take a picture, and that becomes, that's part of that one-on-one communication, and that the way we communicate can be beyond language. And I really do appreciate this thing that we pay attention to, as we've all said, about the power structure that happens where English becomes sort of the dominant or native language. And so just sort of paying attention to that power dynamics. And again, going back to our underlying assumptions, I think is really important. One of the things we do, we sometimes call them target languages instead of native, and that sometimes helps.
I want to ask a couple perhaps different questions, but I think there might be some point of connection here. So bear with me. And I'm trying to do this because we've gotten questions about both, and I think maybe we can cover both, or some of you can kind of cover one and the other. One question came in very early in the session, and the question was, do you need to be a subject matter expert on the subject of the virtual exchange, is one question. And another question was, are all projects or activities implemented also tied to state or government curriculum standards? So I guess what I'm kind of trying to ask you about is, what's the interplay between maybe what people think of as being their main job or their normal job, assuming that they weren't hired to be a virtual exchange facilitator in their education setting? What's the interplay between the expectations of them that they kind of strictly have to meet to impart knowledge and to operate within an existing system, and what they're trying to do with this, which we have talked about, has some really clear and explicit and sometimes even somewhat, people debate this, somewhat measurable aims, but nevertheless, it doesn't necessarily look like what you're doing is just the very most central aspects of what's being expected of educators. So how do you all think about the interplay between expectations or structural issues and what's happening in a virtual exchange?
So can I just start and say that no, you absolutely don't. It's encouraged for you not to be a subject matter expert, to be a facilitator. So the whole point of facilitation is not to impart knowledge. You are there to facilitate. You're there to help the group learn from each other. And like I said before, you don't contribute in the discussion. You don't share any of your own opinions. So whether you are a subject matter expert or not, it's not relevant to facilitation. What is important in facilitation is that you learn the skills, that you understand how to navigate through discussions, how to enhance discussions through asking questions. But you do not need a PhD. You do not need, a master's degree or any certificate in the sense of or an academic degree to be a facilitator. So That's one answer. In terms of the curriculum build, and I know Jamila, you can elaborate more on that, but it really, CELIA builds curriculums, but again, it's to try to cater to the different participants that are taking part in the sessions, in the programs that they're signing up for, and it's tailored to the countries. So whether it's US MENA participants, we do have a US MENA Connect program. We have a Collaborate program, and we have like a Foreign Affairs program. And it depends on which program they're offering that semester, and the curriculum is tailored to that. They do not need to sign it off by government. They do not need to, have a specific standard, because it's specific to CELIA. So that's what I can share.
Just to second what Khulud said, absolutely, you don't need to be a content expert to be a facilitator. Again, the goal with virtual exchange in our experience is really about the experience of communication rather than the actual content. And in fact, at the very beginning, when we first started our program, we first thought we wanted to do these, and we did in a couple of science classes, because we thought, it's STEAM Museum, it'll work perfectly in a science class. And actually, language classes worked out way better for us in terms of sort of the communication and the collaboration part of it. So that's just an indicator of something that we've learned as well. And then in terms of this is a really interesting question about sort of aligning to standards. I think this goes back to sort of finding and identifying the needs of your partners. It's really important to know from the get-go sort of what are the administrative supports that your partner needs and that you need. And some of that may be tying it to standards, and that could be really great and really important, and that could actually expand on your program. For us, for example, in our Chicago classrooms, one of the things that we learned is that it's really great for some of our classrooms for some of our content to be tied to the advanced placement standards. And so we look, and that's some feedback from the teachers. And again, part of it is that teachers are trying to make a case for bringing virtual exchange into their program. And so whatever we can do to, again, be flexible and to adapt and to acknowledge that research exists already and to leverage that, I think makes the program stronger.
Just echoing what the other two have said, and we have found even if many of the IRM projects are kind of curriculum-based, subject-based, whether it's science or math, social studies, our experience is that almost all of those projects become very interdisciplinary very quickly. And so it may well be an environmental science project, but the discussions go off into directions that deal with lots of other issues, and they're really seen as a whole body of a project as opposed to a purely science or an environmental project. And that's because people bring into the project their own experiences, their own culture. And the other thing is that one of the things you want to do is kind of picking up on some of the facilitation skills that were mentioned earlier. We want young people to realize that there's a lot of knowledge within them, within their group, within their community, and to actually be the kind of researchers and find it and share it with the larger group. And so there's a lot of times there's an ask an expert type piece to a project where they go out and find somebody, or they go to a resource, or they go interview an uncle that happens to be in that field of the project. And so it really becomes a way in which they are creators of knowledge and not just recipients.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that with the COIL model, although I echo some of the things that Ed just said, usually the practitioners are content experts. And that's simply because they're conjoined classes, accredited classes, pretty much without exception. And so, although some of those folks might be teaching intercultural competence, et cetera, they may be in that zone in their teaching, some very exciting collaborations were, let's say, civil engineers. So you have actually professors of civil engineering bringing together their students in the US, Brazil, Turkey, and Israel. This is a specific, in fact, exemplar, to discuss how you would build a building in these 4 countries. And so the subject matter is the source. It's how do you do it? And lo and behold, you find out that you do it incredibly differently. And it's so the cultural framework of like how you say do permitting in Brazil versus in New York, such these echo the cultural biases and approaches that people carry around in their head about doing business. So these engineers learn a lot. But the issue there, and definitely the issue in COIL, is are the teachers prepared, ready, and able to deal with the intercultural conflicts and differences that can emerge when most of their training is professional and technical? And that's definitely a challenge for those folks.
Jamila, I want to ask maybe a small point of clarification. An eagle-eyed attendee said that it seemed like you had referred to some folks as facilitators who weren't necessarily classroom teachers. So can you just describe a little bit more who those folks were and what role they played compared to others in the program?
Yeah, so we have the teachers who are in the classroom with the students, and then the facilitators. We have one in Casablanca and one in Chicago, and both of those individuals have the sort of, they go in and they support the teachers in implementing the program. So they'll go into, so the way we are structured right now is that once a week, STEAM Museum takes place in different classrooms, and the facilitator in Chicago, she goes into the classrooms to implement and the program there. And she works with the teachers in partnership with the teachers. So it might look different in every classroom, but she's really there as a sort of as the support there. And same thing in Casablanca.
I think just for the sake of time, I don't want to do what I did last week where I asked some complicated questions as we got down to the end of the time. I'll maybe just ask one closing question, and if you all can take 45 seconds or so to answer it, I would be really grateful. We've had some really concrete and thoughtful specific suggestions and frameworks and ideas shared today about how to think about program design, activity planning, and facilitation. And virtual exchange practitioners have been engaging in a world where online communication is their passion for over a decade, in some case several decades. And we're all now living in a world where virtual communication is indispensable in order to communicate with people who we can't see in person, whether that's internationally or not. I'm curious to know for each of you, what's one thing about what we've talked about today with activity planning or facilitation that you think the current crisis has either thrown into question in some way, that you'll be thinking about this in a new way somehow, or something that you think is true about what we've been describing and especially true in this context? So basically, what can you just share one parting thought with us about the effect of the current crisis and physical distancing on the kinds of things we've been talking about today, just to help people think about, as they're thinking about adapting to this new environment, what do they need to remember to carry what you've shared into this context?
I think a lot about, I'm thinking a lot about equity nowadays, and with the current context, with young people being at home, not everyone has access to technology. This is something even in our experience in STEAM Museum that we've had to, that has been a challenge, and we are, that we've worked through. But I think attending to equity issues is particularly important right now.
I often feel in a COIL class, and this time has made me really think about this, that one of the exciting things is for students to bring back into the class evidence from their community and their world. And in this present time where students have a hard time going out into their community and their world, I'm just think about this a lot. I'm not quite sure how it responds to Henry's question exactly. I think even in the present context, you can go out into the world in some countries. In some countries, you're actually forbidden to go out into the world. In other countries, you may meet protesters who disagree with the entire business. So I think this reflection on community, that this isn't just a small group of people in a class conversing, but that they're to some extent engaging their community and their world, now seems all the more necessary.
I'll mention just two items real quickly, Henry. One is that because this virus is totally unknown and no one knows much about it or how it develops or certainly how to prevent it. And I think it's really raised the whole issue of inquiry-based education. And like no one has the answer. The key is to listen to people and get as much information as possible. So I think that is one of the key things that come out of this for me. And the other one is that because the importance of preparedness and the things that we've talked about today in terms of getting ready prior to a virtual exchange, because many countries' schools shut down overnight and teachers and classes were not prepared whatsoever. Before, it maybe had been a little bit of a project, but they didn't actually teach online. And many were faced with the equity issue that we just heard about. And so I think having that opportunity to prepare for a virtual exchange has been amply demonstrated in the way different countries and schools have actually had to deal with the issue.
And to add on to what Ed said, for me, I've facilitated this semester, and of course, because of COVID, what I noticed is that irrespective of where participants are from, they are very curious to know how the other is doing, and this is so valuable because it humanizes the other. So it's not just about, you know, I want to understand the other. It's we're in the same boat. One participant I remember, you know, COVID does not discriminate, and it's really kind of drawing on that. And they're and they say we look forward to this because we don't have interaction with the outside world. So this is the one thing we look forward to every single week, that I have this, you know, this time to speak to you all. So so for me, that's very valuable, and a lot of people have shifted their perspectives because of it, more so than the previous semesters that I've facilitated. So it really kind of brings us together, ironically enough, the situation we're in.
Before I say goodbye and before we sign off, first I just want to thank all four of you so much, Jamila and Khalud especially, for your great presentations today, and also to Andy, who's on your screen as Stevens Initiative right now. Andy, thanks so much for the introduction. Jamila and Khalud for some great presentations, and big thanks to Ed and John for being here as discussants. Let me share my screen again just so I can preview what's happening in the time ahead. Bear with me just a moment. The next training session, and many of you asked questions in the Q&A box about platforms and technology and common challenges, and we'll be getting into all of that in the next session, which is this Thursday. My colleagues will be sending out an email shortly letting you know about a few more opportunities to join small group sessions with some of these presenters. We'll also be sharing more and more mentoring sessions in the time ahead, so keep an eye out for those announcements when they're available. And as I discussed before, we've listed a grant competition on our website, as well as some resources you can review on your own time that might help you conduct virtual exchange. All of that is available on the Stevens Initiative website, and I encourage you to check it out and get in touch with us if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a very good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thanks again. Bye-bye.